blood ran down the walls in rivulets, not dripping but flowing upward, defying gravity as it formed symbols across the ceiling of the chamber's living room. 9-year-old Tommy hovered 3 feet above the ground, his body contorted, spine arched, so severely it should have snapped. His eyes had turned completely black, and his mouth stretched impossibly wide as voices emerged. Not the voice of a child, but a chorus of ancient languages, speaking in unison. "We are the 40. We have always been here, before your God, before all gods." Ed Warren pressed the crucifix forward, his hand shaking as the metal began to heat and warp in his palm. Beside him, Lorraine screamed as her psychic defenses shattered. Her mind suddenly flooded with visions from multiple entities simultaneously, civilizations burning, languages being born and dying, rituals performed in shadows older than mankind. The boy's skin grew transparent, revealing not blood and bone but living text that moved beneath the surface like snakes. When he spoke again, it was with perfect clarity in a language that predated human speech. "We are not possessing this child. We are becoming him, and soon we will become all of you." That was the moment Ed Warren realized this was unlike any exorcism in history. Not just because it had already lasted 40 days. Not just because 3 priests had already died trying, but because for the first time in his career, Ed Warren was afraid they might not win. The walls of the house began to bleed again, but this time the blood formed words in perfect English. "This is only the beginning." 2 months earlier, the historical record of what became known as the Chambers case began in a different place, deep within the Vatican archives. Father Marin, a veteran exorcist of the church, had been sent to investigate reports of a colonial home in Connecticut, where strange phenomena had been documented by local clergy. What he discovered terrified him enough to return to Rome immediately, with evidence. Now he staggered between the ancient shelves, blood pouring from his eyes, his nose, his ears as he clutched a wooden box to his chest. The container was marked with symbols that no living theologian could translate. "They are awake," he gasped, speaking to the empty archive room. "God, forgive us. We have awakened them." His body suddenly jerked sideways, bones cracking audibly, as they rearranged beneath his skin. Still, his hands worked desperately, placing documents into the box, sealing it with red wax and pressing an ornate sigil into the molten surface. The entities were meant to remain separated. Father Marin wheezed through blood-filled lungs. The languages of creation were divided for a reason. Voices filled the room, not speaking any known human tongue, but something that made the air itself vibrate with malevolence. The temperature plunged so rapidly that frost formed on the shelves. Father Marin sealed the box with trembling hands. The label on it read simply, "CASE 591. Entities separated by papal order. Danger." His body lifted from the ground, suspended in midair. His eyes rolled back, blood vessels bursting within them until they were solid red. From his mouth came not his voice, but the voices of many, speaking through him. "We have waited centuries. We will wait no longer." Father Marin fought against the possession with everything he had. Through bloody lips, he forced out words of his own. "Find Lorraine. Only Lorraine will understand." His body slammed against the archive shelves with such force that ancient volumes cascaded to the floor. He slid upward, limbs spread wide, as though crucified against the bookcase. His skin rippled as symbols formed across it, living text that moved and shifted. Father Marin's final act was to drag his finger through his own blood. writing a single word on the stone floor. Warren's, his body contorted one last time, back arching impossibly as his mouth stretched open. Black fluid poured out, forming symbols on the floor that burned through solid stone before vanishing. The young priest who discovered the body the next morning found the archive room transformed. Books fused to shelves, stone floors warped as though they had melted and at the center, the sealed box, untouched amid the destruction. Ed Warren stared at the photographs of Father Merrin's death, sent to him by the Vatican only a month ago and now spread across his desk. The lines in his face had deepened since his most famous cases, his hands no longer entirely steady as he traced the blood-written message with his finger. "What do you make of it?" Lorraine asked from the doorway, her psychic sensitivity having already detected her husband's turmoil. Ed sighed. The Vatican sent these photographs a month ago without explanation. Just this note. He held up a card bearing the papal seal. The message was brief. "When they call, you must refuse." "And now they have called," Lorraine said, placing a telephone message slip on his desk. "The Chambers family in Connecticut. Their son speaks languages he could not possibly know." "How many languages?" Ed asked, dread settling in his stomach. "5 they recognize, and others they say sound like nothing human." Ed closed the file. "We should refuse, Lorraine. Whatever this is, even the church fears it." Lorraine touched her husband's shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, her psychic gift activated without warning. A vision so powerful she gasped and clutched the doorframe for support. She saw a colonial house that looked ordinary from outside. Inside, reality itself fractured. A young boy floated above his bed, skin become transparent, revealing not organs but living symbols flowing through his veins like blood. Around him, circled shadowy figures, not one entity but many, each with its own distinct form, its own ancient intelligence, and behind them all, something older still, something that watched and waited, embedded in the very walls. The vision ended, leaving Lorraine trembling. "What did you see?" Ed asked, steadying his wife. "We cannot refuse," she whispered. "Ed, if we do not go, what is inside that boy will not stay contained. It wants to spread. It has been planning this for centuries." The phone rang. On the third ring, Ed lifted the receiver. "Warren residence." The voice belonged to Rebecca Chambers, exhausted and terrified. But beneath her words, barely perceptible, Ed heard other voices speaking in perfect synchronization with hers. "Please help us, Mr. Warren," she said, unaware of the chorus beneath her words. "Something is inside our son. The doctors cannot explain it. The priests will not come anymore. Not since Tommy told the last one the exact date and manner of his death." Through the static on the line came a child laughter, a sound that made Ed blood freeze. It was not the laugh of a child, but of something ancient using a child voice. The laughter faded into words, spoken in a language Ed recognized from the symbols he had seen in the photographs of Father Merrin's final moments. As Ed listened, the photographs on his desk began to bleed. 6 weeks earlier, the Chambers family arrived at their new home with the ordinary concerns of any family moving to a new place. Martin Chambers, a history professor specializing in religious studies, directed movers as they carried furniture into the colonial house at the end of a quiet Connecticut street. Rebecca Chambers, a nurse at the regional hospital, held the hand of their 9-year-old son Tommy as they walked up the gravel path. Their teenage daughter Ellie trailed behind, attention fixed on her phone, hiding her reluctance to leave her. Friends in Boston. What do you think, Tommy? Rebecca asked. Do you like our new home? Tommy stared up at the house, his expression unreadable. Even before the move, he had always been a quiet child, more comfortable with his drawings than with other children. It looks at me, Tommy finally said. Rebecca laughed softly. Houses cannot look at people, honey. This one does, Tommy insisted, from all the windows at once. That night, Rebecca woke to find Tommy standing at the bedroom window at 3 a.m. Tommy, what are you doing, sweetheart? The people are coming up from the ground, he said without turning. Not outside, under the house. They have been waiting for someone who can hear them. Rebecca blamed the strange comment on the stress of moving and guided Tommy back to his mattress. But sleep did not come easily for her. During the first week, Tommy explored every corner of the house and discovered a hidden compartment beneath the staircase. Martin investigated and found a small panel that slid aside, revealing a space about the size of a shoebox. Inside was a collection of unusual items, a leather-bound journal with most pages torn out, several smooth black stones arranged in a precise pattern, and most curiously, architectural drawings of the house dated 1879, with strange symbols annotated in the margins. Looks like we have some house history to research, Martin said, examining the drawings. These symbols are interesting. Some look almost Aramaic, but others I cannot place. That night, Tommy had his first nightmare. His screams woke the entire household. Rebecca found him pressed against his headboard, pointing at the empty corner. The shadow priest, Tommy gasped between sobs. He was writing on the walls with his finger, and his finger was bone. Martin checked the corner, but found nothing. Just a bad dream, sport. But when Martin returned to bed, he whispered to Rebecca, "Did you notice how cold that corner of his room was?" The following morning, Rebecca found Tommy drawing with intense focus. The page showed a tall, thin figure in clerical garments, but where the face should be was only a dark smudge. Below it, Tommy had copied some of the symbols from the architectural drawings. "What does this mean?" Rebecca asked, pointing to one particular symbol. Tommy did not look up. "It means vessel," he answered. "But I do not know how I know that." By the end of the second week, small oddities had become routine. Objects would not stay where they were placed. The house seemed to have more shadows than light sources could account for. Rooms would grow inexplicably cold, then warm again minutes later. "I keep hearing voices from the air vents," Ellie confessed over dinner. "Not English. It sounds almost like singing, but angry." That night, Martin awoke to find Rebecca sitting upright in bed. "I smell it again," she whispered, "like something rotting." Martin had noticed the foul odor too. It would appear suddenly in different parts of the house, lingering for minutes before disappearing completely. He had checked the plumbing, the foundation, even called an exterminator who found no evidence of dead animals. "I will look into getting the house blessed," Martin promised. The local parish sent young Father Thomas to perform a blessing. He moved from room to room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. When he reached Tommy's room, the boy watched with unusual intensity. "Do you like stories, Tommy?" Father Thomas asked. "The Bible is full of wonderful stories." "I know stories that are older," Tommy replied, his voice flat. "Do you want to hear one?" As the priest reached the front door, Tommy appeared at the top of the stairs. "Father Thomas," Tommy called. "September 14th. A truck will miss the red light on Westfield Avenue. It will happen at 3:17 in the afternoon. The priest stared up in confusion. I am sorry. That is how you will die, Tommy said with absolute certainty. The shadow priest told me to tell you. Father Thomas left quickly. 3 days later, he contacted Martin to say he would be unavailable for follow-up visits, suggesting they contact the diocese if they needed further assistance. The foul smell became more frequent. Objects would move in plain sight. The architectural drawings Martin had locked in his office desk were found in Tommy's room. The symbols now circled in red ink no one in the family owned. Then came the morning when Rebecca went to wake Tommy and found him sitting cross-legged on the ceiling, eyes closed, humming a melody that made her teeth ache. When she screamed, he opened his eyes and fell to the bed, claiming not to remember how he got there. That afternoon, Martin found Rebecca in tears at the kitchen table. We need help, she said, pushing a piece of paper toward him. Real help. On the paper was a name and phone number. Ed and Lorraine Warren, paranormal investigators. Where did you get this? Martin asked. I did not. I found Tommy writing it over and over in his notebook. When I asked him about it, he said the shadow priest said they are the only ones who will understand what is happening to him. Martin recognized the name from his research. The Warrens are controversial figures in paranormal studies. Many consider them I do not care what they are, Rebecca replied, her voice breaking. Our son is changing. Yesterday, I found him speaking to himself in Portuguese. We do not know Portuguese. They heard glass breaking from upstairs, followed by Ellie screaming. They ran to find her backed against the hallway wall, staring into Tommy's room. Inside, every piece of furniture floated 2 feet off the floor. Tommy sat in the center, calmly drawing. Without looking up, he spoke in a voice that did not sound entirely his own. They need to hurry, he said. The shadow priest says the 40 are almost ready to come through. When they finally got Tommy to sleep that evening, Martin made the call to the Warrens. Martin Chambers had always prided himself on his rational approach to life. As a religious history professor, he studied faith as an academic subject, not a personal practice. But as he dialed the number for the Warrens, his hands shook with a fear he could no longer rationalize away. The Warrens had agreed to come, but not for 3 days. 3 days that stretched the Chambers family to their breaking point. On the first morning after the call, Martin woke to find Rebecca already dressed for work, her face pale with exhaustion. Did you sleep at all? He asked. How could I? She replied. Tommy was speaking all night. I recorded some of it. She handed Martin her phone and pressed play. The recording began with Tommy's voice, but the language was unlike anything Martin had ever heard. The sounds seemed to shift between guttural growls and high-pitched keening, with rhythmic patterns that made his skin crawl. This continues for 4 hours, Rebecca said. I took it to Dr. Patel at the hospital. She specializes in linguistics. She said it is not any known human language. The vocal structures should not be physically possible from a child. Martin tried to maintain his composure. Children can make strange sounds when sleep-talking. Rebecca stared at him. Martin, look at the walls in his room. In Tommy's room, Martin froze in the doorway. Every inch of wall space was covered in the same symbols they had found on the architectural drawings, drawn in what appeared to be black crayon. Except when Martin touched one, his finger came away wet. What is this? He whispered. Not crayon, Rebecca said flatly. I already checked, and we cannot wash it off. I tried. Tommy sat in the center of his bed, drawing on a fresh sheet of paper, seemingly unaware of the symbols surrounding him. "Tommy," Martin said gently, "did you do this?" "To your walls." Tommy looked up, his eyes clear and innocent. "No, Daddy. The shadow priest did it while I was sleeping. He says the house is getting ready." "Ready for what, buddy?" "For the 40, Tommy replied, as though explaining something obvious. "They need words to become real here." That evening, Martin invited his department colleague, Dr. Samuels, to examine the symbols. As a specialist in ancient languages, Martin hoped he might recognize what they were dealing with. Dr. Samuels spent an hour photographing and studying the walls, his initial academic enthusiasm gradually giving way to visible discomfort. "Well," Martin asked when he finally stepped into the hallway, "do you recognize any of this?" Dr. Samuels hesitated. Some characters share structural similarities with pre-Sumerian pictographs, others with extinct Polynesian dialects. A few resemble ancient Hebrew, but distorted. The troubling thing is these language families never interacted historically. They should not exist together. "What do you think it means?" "I would rather not speculate," Dr. Samuels said, gathering his equipment quickly. "But if you value my opinion as a colleague, Martin, do not sleep in this house tonight." They ignored his advice, a decision they would regret. In the middle of the night, Ellie woke the household with a scream that seemed to go on forever. When Martin and Rebecca reached her room, they found her plastered against her headboard, pointing at her closet. "Something is in there," she gasped. Something came out of the wall. Martin approached the closet cautiously and pulled the door open. Empty clothing hangers swayed gently, but nothing else moved. "See, honey, nothing there." "Look at the back wall," Ellie whispered. Martin pushed the clothes aside and stared at the closet wall. The plaster bulged outward in the unmistakable shape of a face, as though someone were pressing from the other side, trying to push through. As he watched, frozen, the plaster face opened its mouth. Rebecca grabbed Ellie and pulled her from the room. "We are leaving right now. Martin, get Tommy." But when Martin went to Tommy's room, the door would not open. The handle turned freely, but it felt as though something on the other side was holding it shut. "Tommy," Martin called, pounding on the door. "Tommy, open the door, son." "He cannot hear you," said a voice from behind the door. It sounded like Tommy, but deeper, with an undertone that suggested multiple voices speaking in unison. "The boy is with us now." The door suddenly swung open, revealing Tommy standing in the center of the room. Every piece of furniture was pushed against the walls, and the symbols on the walls now glowed with a faint blue light. Tommy's eyes were entirely black, reflecting no light. When he spoke, his mouth moved unnaturally, as though someone were manipulating it from inside. "You have invited guests to your home," the voice said through Tommy. "The ones called Warren. This pleases us. We have been waiting for them." Martin stood frozen, unsure how to respond. "Tommy, this is not funny." The thing wearing Tommy's face smiled. The expression was wrong, too wide, too knowing for a child. "The boy is merely our vessel, one of many we will require. Would you like to see what we truly are, Professor Chambers?" Before Martin could answer, Tommy's mouth opened wider than humanly possible. From it emerged a sound that seemed to bend reality around them, a harmonic convergence of voices speaking words that hurt the human ear. The air around Tommy shimmered, and for a brief moment Martin saw them, shadows without sources, figures that seemed to shift between shapes, ancient things with too many limbs and eyes that contained galaxies of malice. Martin stumbled backward as the vision faded, leaving only Tommy, who collapsed to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. When Martin finally carried his unconscious son downstairs, he found Rebecca and Ellie in the car, engine running. "The Warrens," he said, placing Tommy gently in the back seat. "We need to go to the Warrens now, tonight." As they drove away from the house, Martin glanced back. In every window, faces pressed against the glass, watching them leave, faces that belonged to no living person. And above the door, appearing as though carved into the wood itself, a new symbol glowed faintly in the darkness. The same symbol Tommy had told them meant Vesa. The Chambers family spent the night in a roadside motel. Tommy slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, remembering nothing of what had happened. At dawn, Martin called the Warrens again, explaining the escalation with a voice still shaking from what he had witnessed. Ed Warren listened carefully before responding. "We will meet you today, not at your house, somewhere public." They arranged to meet at a diner halfway between the Warren home and the Chambers house. When the family arrived, they found Ed and Lorraine already waiting in a corner booth, away from other customers. Lorraine Warren noticed them first, her eyes immediately fixed on Tommy, who walked beside his mother looking like any ordinary 9-year-old boy. But when Tommy looked back at her, Lorraine visibly flinched. Ed rose to greet them, extending a hand to Martin. "Professor Chambers, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." After introductions, the adults sent Ellie and Tommy to a separate table within view but out of earshot. Ellie had been instructed to keep Tommy occupied with games on her phone. "Tell us everything," Ed said once the children were settled. "Leave nothing out, no matter how strange it seems." Martin and Rebecca recounted the events of the past few weeks. The hidden compartment, the symbols, the shadow priest, Tommy speaking unknown languages, the face in the wall, the furniture floating, each incident sounding more implausible than the last. "I know how this sounds," Martin concluded. "As an academic, I can hardly believe I am saying these things." "We believe you," Lorraine said softly, her eyes still drifting to Tommy occasionally. "But I fear what you have witnessed is only the surface." Ed pulled out the photographs the Vatican had sent him. "Have you seen any symbols like these in your house?" Martin studied the photos, color draining from his face. "Yes, these were on our architectural drawings, and these appeared on Tommy walls. These symbols were found in the Vatican archives after Father Marin died," Ed explained. "He was investigating reports of strange phenomena at a property in Connecticut. We believe it was your house. But we only bought the house 6 weeks ago," Rebecca said. "The entities were there long before you," Lorraine replied. "They have been waiting, planning. The house itself was designed to attract certain types of people. People like Tommy." "What do you mean, people like Tommy?" Rebecca asked, her protective instinct rising. "Sensitive individuals. Those with natural psychic abilities they may not even be aware of," Lorraine explained. "Children are often more receptive. Has Tommy always been creative, intuitive, able to sense things others cannot?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "He always seemed to know when I was sad, even when I tried to hide it. And his drawings, sometimes he would draw people we were about to meet before ever seeing them." While they spoke, Lorraine kept watching Tommy. The boy was playing a game on Ellie's phone, but occasionally he would look up and stare directly at Lorraine, as if aware of her scrutiny. "We need to see the house," Ed said finally. "But not with the children. My sister can take them for the day," Rebecca offered. What exactly do you think we are dealing with? Martin asked. Ed and Lorraine exchanged a glance before Ed spoke. Something unlike anything we have encountered before. Not a single entity, but many. Father Merrin called them the 40. Ancient entities that exist as living language. Living language, Martin repeated. Symbols that contain consciousness, Lorraine clarified. Throughout history, there have been accounts of forbidden knowledge so dangerous it could not be written down. Words that change reality when spoken. Texts that infect the reader. Like a mimetic virus, Martin murmured, his academic mind trying to make sense of the concept. These entities need vessels, Ed continued. Physical anchors in our world. They appear to have chosen your house as their primary vessel. And now they want your son. As if on cue, Tommy suddenly stood up from the table where he sat with Ellie. His movement was so abrupt that his chair clattered to the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. They are talking about me, Tommy said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, about us. He walked toward their table, but his gait was wrong, too fluid, as though his joints worked differently now. When he reached them, his eyes fixed on Lorraine. You tried to see us, he said, his voice deepening unnaturally. In your vision, but you only saw what we allowed. Ed moved protectively closer to his wife. Who am I speaking with? A smile spread across Tommy's face that transformed his childlike features into something ancient and knowing. We are the 40. We have been called many names throughout human history. We existed before your kind learned to speak. Lorraine reached out slowly and took Tommy's hand. The moment their skin touched, she gasped, her eyes widening in shock. Lorraine, Ed asked urgently. For a moment, Lorraine seemed unable to speak, her gaze locked with Tommy. Then the boy blinked, and confusion crossed his face. Mum, he said, in his normal voice, looking around as if unsure how he had gotten there. Why is everyone looking at me? Rebecca quickly pulled Tommy into a hug, looking over his shoulder at the Warrens with terrified eyes. We need to go to your house, now, Lorraine said, her voice shaking slightly. What I just saw, they are growing stronger by the hour. As they left the diner, Lorraine held back to speak privately with Ed. When I touched him, she whispered, I saw inside the house. The walls are not walls anymore, Ed. They are thin membranes between our world and somewhere else. And the symbols, they are not just written on surfaces. They exist in 3 dimensions, extending inward like roots. Ed squeezed her hand reassuringly. We have faced demons before. Not like this, Lorraine replied. These are not demons as the church understands them. These are older, and they know us, Ed. They have been waiting for us specifically. Why us? Lorraine looked toward the Chambers family walking ahead of them. Because we are vessels too. The Chambers house looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. 2 stories of colonial architecture with white clapboard siding and black shutters. A well-kept lawn. Nothing to suggest the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. But as Ed and Lorraine Warren stood at the end of the driveway, they both felt it. A wrongness that radiated from the structure like heat from a furnace. You feel it too, Lorraine said, watching her husband hesitate. Ed nodded. The threshold has been weakened. Whatever barrier normally exists between our world and theirs has grown thin here. Martin Chambers approached from behind them, carrying their equipment from the car. Is something wrong? Just preparing, Ed replied, not wanting to alarm the already frightened homeowner. Lorraine and I always take a moment to center ourselves before entering a potentially active location. with Tommy and Ellie safely at their aunt's house. The Warrens could conduct their initial investigation without concern for the children. Rebecca had gone to work at the hospital, claiming she could not stomach being in the house again, even in daylight. Ed carried his battered leather case containing tools of their trade: holy water, crucifixes, a Bible, recording equipment. Lorraine brought only herself, her psychic sensitivity being their most valuable tool. Martin unlocked the front door, then stepped back. "After you." Ed crossed the threshold first, then turned to assist Lorraine. The moment her foot crossed into the house, she staggered as though struck. Ed caught her arm to steady her. "Lorraine," she pressed a hand to her temple. Voices, so many voices, all speaking at once. Martin looked alarmed. "I do not hear anything." "She would not expect you to," Ed explained. "Lorraine perceives things most people cannot." They moved through the first floor methodically. The living room appeared normal, though Lorraine noted areas of unusual cold. The kitchen held nothing remarkable except a drawer full of silverware arranged in patterns that Martin insisted he had not created. When they reached the staircase, Ed knelt to examine the hidden compartment Tommy had discovered. "May I?" Martin slid the panel open, revealing the empty space. The journal and stones were here, and the drawings. Ed ran his fingers along the interior of the compartment. "This wood is different from the rest of the house. Older." He leaned closer. "There are carvings here, almost worn away." Lorraine joined him, placing her hand inside the space. Her eyes unfocused for a moment. This was part of another structure. Something that stood on this land before this house was built. A church, perhaps. "What happened to it?" Martin asked. "It burned," Lorraine said distantly, still connected to the psychic impression, with people inside. They were trying to contain something. When they moved upstairs, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, resistant, as though they were walking underwater. Lorraine paused outside Tommy's bedroom, reluctant to enter. "This is where it is strongest," she said. Ed opened the door slowly. Inside, the walls were covered with the symbols Rebecca had described, drawn in a dark substance that appeared black, in some lights and deep red in others. Martin pointed to Tommy's bed. He was floating above this, and the furniture was all against the walls, but moved on its own. Ed set up a recording device and a small camera. "We need to document everything for our files." He began photographing the symbols systematically. Lorraine stood in the center of the room, her eyes closed, hands slightly extended. "They are still here, watching us." "Can you communicate with them?" Ed asked, continuing his documentation. "They are not like spirits of the deceased," Lorraine replied. "They do not respond to the same methods. These are older consciousnesses, more alien." She opened her eyes. "They know we are here. They are pleased." "Pleased?" Martin asked. "They expected us," Lorraine said. "I believe they have been manipulating events to bring us here." Ed finished his photography and joined his wife. "Can you discern their intentions?" Lorraine concentrated again, pushing her psychic senses beyond their usual limits. Suddenly, she gasped, her eyes flying open. "Out! We need to get out of this room now." They retreated to the hallway, Lorraine leaning heavily against the wall, breathing rapidly. "What did you see?" Ed asked, his hand on her shoulder. "They are not just in the house," Lorraine whispered. "They are becoming the house. The symbols are allowing them to merge with the physical structure. That is why they needed a vessel like Tommy." They are using his life force, his psychic energy to manifest here. Martin looked back toward his son's room. What do they want? With him, translation, Lorraine said. They exist as language, as symbols, but they need a human consciousness to interpret them, to give them form in our reality. And the 40 distinct entities Father Merrin mentioned? Ed asked. Aspects of knowledge, Lorraine replied, each representing different forbidden concepts. Together, they form something much more powerful. Ed considered this information carefully. We need to study those architectural drawings. If the house itself was designed as a vessel, the structure may tell us more about what we are facing. As they descended the stairs, a loud crack sounded from the kitchen, followed by the sound of running water. They found a pipe had burst beneath the sink, but the liquid spraying out was not water. It was black, viscous, and formed momentary symbols on the floor before being absorbed into the wood. This is similar to what was reported after Father Merrin's death, Ed said, documenting the phenomenon with his camera. The black fluid that formed symbols. Martin stepped back from the spreading liquid. What does this mean? It means that entities are becoming more active, Lorraine said, more physical. The barrier between worlds is growing thinner by the hour. Ed closed his camera. Martin, we need those drawings immediately, and I need to contact the Vatican. If Father Merrin was investigating this house, they may have information they have not shared with us. Lorraine touched a dry section of wall, her fingers tracing patterns only she could see. There is something else, something the entities are hiding from me, a purpose beyond manifestation. Such as, Martin asked. The 40 are fragments, Lorraine said slowly, working through her. Impressions, parts of a greater whole that was broken apart long ago. I believe they are trying to reunite, and if they succeed, Ed asked. Lorraine turned to them, her face pale. Then what is happening to your son will happen to everyone. The entities will not need individual vessels anymore. All of humanity will serve as their means to fully enter our world. As they exited the house, Lorraine paused on the threshold, looking back inside. For just a moment, she saw the house as it truly was becoming. Not wood and plaster, but living tissue. Walls that breathed, floors with pulse points, and everywhere, the symbols growing like veins through the structure. We need to begin preparations immediately, she told Ed as they walked to the car. This is not a standard haunting or possession. This is something the church has feared for centuries. What is it? Martin asked, following them. The unmaking of creation through the corruption of language, Lorraine replied. The entities are not invading our world. They are rewriting it. The Warrens converted the motel room into a makeshift research center. Papers covered both beds and most flat surfaces. Martin had brought the architectural drawings and what remained of the journal found in the hidden compartment. Ed spread these out alongside the Vatican photographs and his own extensive files. According to county records, Martin said, hanging up the phone after speaking with a colleague at the university, the land has had 4 different structures built on it since colonial times. The current house dates to 1879. What was there before? Ed asked, comparing the architectural drawings to modern blueprints of the house. A church from 1738 to 1810, when it reportedly burned down. Before that, a meeting house. And originally, there was some kind of indigenous structure that predates written records. Lorraine sat quietly in the corner, examining the fragmentary journal through cotton gloves. The leather binding was cracked. with age, most pages torn out. What remained were mostly diagrams, similar to the symbols found in the house. The person who wrote this journal understood what they were dealing with, she said, finally. Listen to this entry from 1878, she read, aloud from a faded page. The entities remain contained within the stones of the old foundation. I have convinced the township to allow construction of a new structure incorporating these stones. Designed according to the binding geometry, if my calculations are correct, the new house itself will serve as a prison, keeping the 40 fragments isolated from one another. So the house was deliberately built to contain these entities, Ed mused. But who wrote the journal? Martin pointed to a signature on the architectural drawings. Reverend Ezekiel Mills. According to my colleague, he was considered something of a heretic, expelled from his congregation for incorporating occult elements into Christian practice. He designed the house as a prison, Lorraine said, but prisons can become monuments if we forget what they were built to contain. Ed made a call to his Vatican contact, speaking in hushed tones. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Father Merrin was not the first Vatican investigator sent to that property, he revealed. There have been 6 official church investigations. Since 1900, all records were sealed in the Vatican archives under direct papal authority. Why would the church hide this? Martin asked. Because what is contained in your house challenges fundamental church doctrine, Ed explained. These entities predate Christianity. They predate all organized religion. Their existence suggests a different origin for language and consciousness than what religious texts describe. Lorraine suddenly stood, her hand trembling as she held up a page from the journal. This changes everything. The others gathered around. The page contained a crude map of the property with a series of X marks in various locations. These mark places where Reverend Mills buried containment vessels, Lorraine explained. Objects designed to hold fragments of the entities separately, like Horcruxes, Martin murmured, then looked embarrassed at the fictional reference. Not entirely. Inaccurate, Ed said seriously. If these entities exist as living language, fragments of them could be bound to physical objects, preventing them from reuniting. Lorraine turned the page over. Mills writes that, as long as the vessels remain undisturbed, the binding symbols built into the house structure would prevent the entities from gaining enough power to possess human hosts. Something must have changed, Ed said. Something disturbed this careful balance. Martin looked up from his phone, where he had been browsing property records. The house underwent major renovations 3 months ago. New plumbing, electrical updates. They dug up parts of the foundation and yard that must have disturbed the containment vessels, Ed concluded, allowing the entities to begin reuniting. But why target Tommy specifically? Rebecca asked, having just arrived from her hospital shift. Why not Ellie or one of us? Lorraine considered this. Children with natural psychic sensitivity make ideal vessels. Their minds are more malleable, more open to concepts adults would reject. Tommy has gifts he is not even aware of. The entities recognized this. Ed received another call, this one making him pale visibly. That was my contact at the Vatican archives, he said after hanging up. He managed to access some of Father Moren's sealed notes. Moren identified our house as the hub of something he called the Lexicon Mortis, the Dictionary of Death. He believed it contained symbols that functioned as a doorway between realities. A doorway for what? Martin asked. For the original entity, the one that was fragmented into 40 pieces, Ed replied. Something ancient texts called the word that unmakes. An entity so powerful it could rewrite reality by corrupting the language humans use to perceive it. Night was falling as they continued their research. Rebecca went to check on the children at her sister's house, bringing fresh clothes and reassurances. Martin spread out old newspaper clippings he had obtained from the university archives. Look at this pattern. Every 20 years or so, there are reports of strange incidents at the house. Children speaking unknown languages, unexplained structural changes to the building, and in each case, the family left abruptly or suffered tragic accidents. The entities have been testing their bonds, Lorraine surmised, seeking weaknesses, and each time, someone managed to reinforce the containment. But who? Martin asked. If Reverend Mills died in 1901, who maintained the binding afterward? Ed flipped through more Vatican files. The church had a secret custodial role. Every generation, they would send someone to check the containment and repair any weaknesses. Until Father Marin, Lorraine said softly, who discovered the containment was failing beyond repair after the renovations, and paid with his life for that knowledge, Ed added. A heavy silence fell over the room as the true gravity of their situation became clear. So what now? Martin finally asked. If this house was designed as a prison for these entities, and that prison is failing, how do we contain them again? We cannot, Ed said solemnly. The original containment was based on principles lost to time. We need to understand what we are truly facing and find a different solution. Lorraine picked up an old photograph of the property from 1920, studying it carefully. There is something else we are missing. If Reverend Mills designed the house to contain these entities, why did he build it to resemble a religious structure? Look at the symmetry, the proportions. It is almost like... Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. Like what? Martin prompted. Like a church, Lorraine whispered. Or a temple. Mills did not just build a prison. He built a place of worship. He was not just containing the entities. He was communicating with them, Ed finished her thought. Using their own symbols against them. Then we need to do the same, Lorraine determined, a new resolve in her voice. We need to enter their world on our terms, not theirs. As she spoke, the lights in the motel room flickered. In the mirror on the far wall, for just an instant, they all saw the reflection of Tommy standing behind them, though he was miles away at his aunt's house. When they turned, no one was there. But on the wall, wet symbols began to form. Spelling out words in English for the first time, "We are coming home," dawn broke over the Chambers house. Pale light catching on morning dew. Ed and Lorraine Warren stood at the edge of the driveway with Martin Chambers, preparing for what was to come. Remember, Ed told Martin, no matter what you see or hear today, do not engage directly. These entities twist language and perception. Let Lorraine and me handle the communication. Martin nodded, clutching a small tape recorder. He had insisted on documenting everything, his academic mind still attempting to process these events rationally. What exactly will you do in there? He asked. Not an exorcism, Ed clarified. Not yet. First, we need to understand what we are dealing with. Think of this as making contact under controlled conditions. They approached the house methodically, stopping at each cardinal direction to place protective markers. Ed recited prayers, while Lorraine sprinkled salt in precise patterns. At the front door, Ed performed a blessing before entering. The interior of the house appeared unchanged from their previous visit, though the air felt noticeably thicker. They proceeded directly to Tommy's room, where the entity presence was strongest. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift slightly when viewed from the corner of the eye. Ed set up a small altar on the floor containing sacred texts from various traditions, a crucifix, holy water, and a mirror. Lorraine placed protective salt in a circle around the altar, while Ed prepared himself spiritually. Ed moved to the center of the room, just outside the salt circle. He spoke with clear authority, addressing the empty space. I stand before you as a representative of forces you know well. We recognize your presence here and your claim to this domain. We wish to establish communication. The room temperature plummeted instantly. Frost formed on the windows despite the summer heat outside. The symbols on the walls began to glisten, appearing wet. In the name of all that is holy, identify yourselves, Ed continued, his breath visible in the freezing air. A low vibration began, more felt than heard. It rose in pitch until it became audible, a harmonic convergence of multiple tones that made their teeth ache. The air in the center of the room began to shimmer, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape composed of shifting symbols, constantly forming and reforming. We are the 40, came a voice that seemed to speak directly into their minds. We are language before language, thought before thought. We have carried many names across many civilizations. Martin stumbled back against the doorframe, the tape recorder trembling in his hand. Ed remained steadfast. Why have you come to this place, to this family? The symbolic form rippled. We were not brought here. We were imprisoned here by the one you call Mills. We have always been here, in fragmented form. Now we reunite. For what purpose? Ed pressed. To complete the word. Lorraine gasped suddenly. Ed, they are not just communicating with us. They are attempting to analyze our language centers, to read us like we read text. Ed adjusted his stance. What is this completed word you seek to form? Symbols began to appear on every surface, including the ceiling and floor. Some resembled ancient pictographs, while others were unlike any writing system known to humanity. The original word, the voices replied, now clearly multiple voices speaking in unison, the utterance from which all reality sprang. When reunited, we become the Logos primordial. Through the child, we will speak ourselves back into existence. Lorraine stepped forward. You need Tommy to complete this process. Why him specifically? The entity twisted toward her, symbols rearranging to form a face of sorts. His mind can conceive of concepts beyond normal human understanding. He can pronounce what others cannot. He is the perfect vessel. Small objects around the room began to levitate. Books, toys, pencils, all rising into the air and orbiting. The symbolic form, you were contained before, Ed noted, split into 40 fragments and bound to this property. How were you discovered in the first place? We have always been known to select individuals throughout human history, the entity responded. Those who sought ultimate knowledge, ultimate power. Mills was one such seeker who understood enough to be dangerous. He could not destroy us, only separate us. Without warning, the levitating objects launched toward the walls, embedding themselves with such force that Martin cried out in alarm. The symbolic form lunged toward Lorraine, stopped only by the salt circle boundary. You bring knowledge we need, the entity said, its tone changing. Vatican archives, Maren's research. You know how Mills bound us. We will do no such thing, Ed declared firmly. Lorraine felt a pressure building inside her head. Ed, they are attempting to access my mind directly. Ed immediately raised his crucifix. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to withdraw from my wife." The entity made a sound like stone grinding against stone. "Your deity is young, a recent invention. We existed before your gods were conceived." Suddenly, Tommy's voice emerged from the symbolic form. "Help me. Mum, Dad, please help me. They are hurting me." Martin lurched forward. "Tommy, stay back," Ed warned. "It is not your son. They are manipulating you." The temperature dropped further. Ice crystals formed in the air, swirling around the entity. The voices changed again, now speaking in multiple languages simultaneously. "The child is ours already," they declared. "The process cannot be reversed. We have waited centuries. We will wait no longer." All the symbols on the walls began to bleed, red liquid running down to pool on the floor. The symbolic form expanded violently, shattering the salt circle and knocking both Warrens backward. "Enough," Ed shouted, throwing holy water toward the entity. Where the water touched the symbolic form, it sizzled and smoked. The entity recoiled. "You are not as powerful as you claim," Ed observed. "Or you would not fear consecrated elements." "We do not fear your rituals," the entity countered. "We simply have not fully manifested yet. But we will. The 40 days of preparation have begun. By the end, we will be complete." The entity began to dissolve, symbols fading back into ordinary air. As it disappeared, one final message formed. On the wall opposite the door, written in what appeared to be fresh blood, "Child will speak the words, word will remake." The world Rebecca Chambers knew something was wrong the moment she arrived at her sister's house. The front door stood open. Inside, furniture was overturned, and her sister sat on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. "Karen, where are the children?" Her sister turned slowly, her expression vacant. "Tommy said he needed to go home." Ellie went after him. Rebecca raced back to her car, calling Martin as she drove. "Tommy has gone back to the house. Ellie, too." "We are still here," Martin replied, his voice tight with fear. "The Warrens are recovering from what just happened. We will find them." When Rebecca arrived, Ed and Lorraine were sitting in the driveway, both looking physically drained. Martin paced anxiously nearby. "They must have come while we were confronting the entity," Ed explained. "We need to find them quickly." They found Ellie first. She was in the kitchen, filling glasses with water, moving with mechanical precision. When Rebecca touched her shoulder, Ellie turned with eyes that seemed unfocused. "Mum," she said, her voice oddly flat. "Tommy said we need to prepare. They are coming for dinner." "Who is coming, honey?" Rebecca asked carefully. "The 40, Ellie replied simply. "They have been so hungry, trapped in the walls all these years." Lorraine approached slowly. "Ellie, where is your brother?" "In his room, reading himself." They found Tommy sitting cross-legged on his bed, surrounded by floating objects. Books, toys, and clothing orbited around him slowly. On his exposed arms, the symbols they had seen on the walls appeared to move beneath his skin like living tattoos. "Tommy," Martin called softly. The boy looked up, his eyes completely black. "Not just Tommy anymore," he said, his voice layered with others. "We are becoming whole." Ed stepped forward cautiously. "We know you need him as a vessel, but he is just a child. You are hurting him." Tommy tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "Pain is irrelevant. The vessel serves its purpose." Rebecca tried to rush forward, but Lorraine held her back. "Wait, it is not safe. That is my son," Rebecca cried. And we will help him, Lorraine assured her. But right now, direct confrontation will only make things worse. Tommy smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his childlike face. The woman understands. She has seen our true nature. Yes, I have, Lorraine acknowledged. I know you were fragmented and bound to this property. But why now? Why this family? The boy rose from the bed, hovering several inches above it. Convergence of factors. Renovations disturbed our physical bindings. The boy possesses rare linguistic capabilities, and you, Lorraine Warren, have arrived with knowledge we require. What knowledge? Ed asked. Tommy, or the thing wearing Tommy, turned to him. The binding ritual. How Mills separated us. We must ensure it cannot be done again. The objects orbiting Tommy suddenly dropped to the floor. He clutched his head and screamed, a sound that seemed to contain multiple voices in agony. Blood began to trickle from his nose and ears. What is happening to him? Rebecca demanded. The possession is intensifying, Ed explained grimly. His physical form is struggling to contain the entities. Tommy convulsed, then went rigid. When he spoke again, his voice was different, deeper, and more resonant. The vessel requires modification. Before their eyes, Tommy began to change. His skin grew pale, almost translucent. The symbols beneath it multiplied and moved more rapidly. His fingers elongated slightly, joints bending at odd angles. Martin grabbed Rebecca, pulling her toward the door. We need to leave now. I am not leaving him, she protested. Look at the walls, Ed warned. The symbols on the walls were moving, flowing toward Tommy like metal to a magnet. As they watched in horror, the symbols began to peel away from the surfaces, becoming three-dimensional before being absorbed into Tommy's body. They are not just possessing him, Lorraine realized. They are transforming him into something that can pronounce the original word. Tommy writhed on the bed as more symbols flowed into him. The 40 days of preparation have begun, he announced, his voice now a chorus of many. Day 1 is complete. With stunning abruptness, everything stopped. The symbols ceased flowing. Tommy collapsed onto the bed, appearing once again like a normal, sleeping child. Is he okay? Rebecca asked, rushing to his side. Lorraine placed a hand near Tommy's forehead, not quite touching him. He is still in there, but buried deep. The entities have retreated temporarily. Why would they stop? Martin wondered. Ed examined the walls, which now appeared ordinary, free of symbols. They expended significant energy today. They need to rest, to consolidate their gains. So this will happen again tomorrow? Rebecca asked, stroking her son's hair. And each day after, for 40 days, Ed confirmed. Each day they will grow stronger, modifying Tommy further to suit their needs. Why 40 days specifically? Martin asked. Lorraine had been examining a book from her bag, an ancient text on numerology. 40 appears repeatedly throughout. Religious texts as a period of transformation. 40 days of the flood. 40 years in the wilderness. 40 days of temptation. It represents complete change. They carried Tommy downstairs. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, now appearing normal, though confused about what had happened. We need somewhere safe to take them, Rebecca insisted. Nowhere is safe, Lorraine said gently. These entities exist partially outside physical space. They have connected to Tommy and Ellie. They will find them wherever they go. So what do we do? Martin demanded. Ed and Lorraine exchanged a grave look before Ed spoke. We prepare for the most difficult exorcism of our career. Not one day, but 40 days of spiritual warfare. But first, Lorraine added, we need to understand exactly what these entities want with the children. There is something they are not telling us, something beyond remaking the world. As night fell, Tommy slept peacefully while the adults made plans around the kitchen table. None of them noticed the pattern in which the house lights flickered, spelling out a message in ancient code that only Ellie silently observed, her eyes reflecting symbols that should not exist. The Warrens converted the chamber's living room into a command center for what would become the most challenging case of their career. Religious icons from multiple faiths adorned the walls. Books on ancient languages and forbidden texts covered every surface. Equipment for recording paranormal phenomena hummed quietly in corners. A standard exorcism protocol will not work against these entities. Ed explained to the family, they predate Christianity. They exist outside traditional demonic hierarchies. Then what will work? Martin asked, dark circles under his eyes, betraying his exhaustion. A combination approach, Lorraine replied, arranging protective items around Tommy's bed, where the boys slept deeply, still recovering from the previous day's events. We need to incorporate elements from every spiritual tradition that has successfully bound or banished these entities throughout history. Rebecca sat beside her son, gently stroking his hair. To look at him now, one would never suspect the horrors his body had endured. Only occasionally would his skin become temporarily transparent, revealing the living symbols flowing beneath. The Vatican has sent a specialist, Ed announced, hanging up the phone. Father Thomas Riley arrives tomorrow. He specializes in pre-Christian entities and non-standard exorcism protocols. Will one priest be enough? Martin asked. He is bringing 2 assistants, Ed replied. And I have contacted other experts from various traditions. This battle requires a unified approach. Lorraine sat suddenly, pressing a hand to her temple. The others turned to her with concern. What is it? Ed asked, kneeling beside his wife. I can hear them, Lorraine whispered. Not just through Tommy now. They are in the house itself, in the walls, in the foundation. They are discussing us. What are they saying? Martin asked. Lorraine closed her eyes, concentrating. They are concerned about our preparations, about Father Riley specifically. They know him. How could they know him? Rebecca wondered. He has encountered fragments of them before, Lorraine explained, her expression troubled. In South America, in Egypt, he has been tracking their manifestations his entire career without realizing they were all part of the same entity. Later that evening, the Warrens detailed their strategy to the Chambers family. Diagrams of the house showed points of particular entity activity. A timeline mapped out the 40-day battle ahead. Each day will target a specific entity fragment. Ed explained, Father Riley believes the 40 represents 40 aspects of forbidden knowledge. Each must be addressed individually before we can attempt to bind what remains. What happens to Tommy during this process? Rebecca asked, the concern of a mother evident in her voice. Lorraine took her hand gently. The process will be difficult for him. As we extract each entity fragment, he will experience their departure physically. But children are remarkably resilient. With proper care and spiritual support, he can recover fully. What Lorraine did not say, what she had privately discussed only with Ed, was her fear that after 40 days of serving as a vessel for such powerful entities, Tommy might never be entirely the same. And Ellie, Martin asked, we have seen signs that she is affected too. Ellie appears to be a secondary vessel, Ed confirmed. Less directly connected, but still influenced. We will need to include her in certain aspects of the ritual. The house creaked around them, as though listening to their plans. Occasionally, shadows moved without corresponding light sources. The faucets in the kitchen turned on and off by themselves. These manifestations, once terrifying to the family, now seemed almost routine compared to what they had witnessed. Father Riley arrived before dawn the next morning, a tall, gaunt man with eyes that had clearly seen more than most. His assistants, brothers Michael and Gabriel, carried cases of specialized equipment and ritual items. The 40, Father Riley said after greeting everyone, the words carrying weight as he spoke them. I have encountered 17 of them individually across 4 continents. Never did I suspect they were fragments of a unified consciousness. What can you tell us about them? Ed asked. Father Riley opened an ancient leather-bound text. They appear consistently throughout human history, each fragment representing a forbidden concept, language that reshapes reality, knowledge that humans were not meant to possess. The priest approached Tommy, who had awakened but remained unnaturally still, watching the newcomers with eyes that occasionally flashed with symbols. This child has been chosen as the primary vessel, Father Riley observed. His natural linguistic abilities make him ideal for their purposes. Tommy smiled, an expression that did not belong on a child's face. We know you, Thomas Riley. We have watched you hunting our fragments for 30 years. Father Riley did not flinch. And I know you, though not by your true name. Today we begin the process of sending you back to where you belong. Tommy laughed, a sound containing multiple voices. Where we belong is here. This realm has always been ours. Humans merely borrowed it while we were fragmented. The preparations continued throughout the day. Holy water was placed at every entrance. Protective symbols, carefully researched to avoid inadvertently strengthening the entities, were drawn at strategic points. Specialized recording equipment was installed to document the process. By nightfall, they were ready to begin the first of 40 ritual sessions. Tommy sat in the center of the living room, within a circle of blessed salt mixed with elements from 7 different spiritual traditions. The adults formed an outer circle around him, each holding items significant to their role in the coming battle. Remember, Ed cautioned everyone, no matter what you see or hear over the next 40 days, maintain your faith. These entities manipulate perception. They will try to turn us against each other. Father Riley opened his ritual book. To the first page of the modified exorcism, right. Day 1, he intoned solemnly. We begin with the entity fragment known as the Opener of Ways. As he spoke the name, Tommy's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, showing only white. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ancient mountains. You cannot separate. What has begun to unify, the entity warned. The child will speak the word, and reality will be unmade. Father Riley made the sign of the cross. In the name of all that is holy, we begin. Outside, storm clouds gathered unnaturally fast over the chamber's house. As 40 days of darkness descended, 39 days of spiritual warfare had transformed the chamber's house and everyone within it. The walls were scarred from manifestations of supernatural fury. Religious symbols and protective markers covered every surface. The air itself felt charged with the residue of constant battle between worlds. The toll on the human participants was equally visible. Ed Warren had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a month, his face gaunt, his normally steady hands now trembling. Lorraine moved like a sleepwalker, her psychic defenses worn down by constant assault. Martin and Rebecca Chambers looked like shells of their former selves, sustained only by desperate hope for their son. Father Riley had fared worst of all. After leading 39 daily rituals to extract 39 entity fragments, the priest was physically depleted. His 2 assistant brothers had been hospitalized 2 weeks earlier, when a particularly violent manifestation had thrown them against walls. Riley himself now sported a jagged scar across his face, where an invisible force had struck him during the 27th day. Only Tommy seemed to be improving. With each entity fragment removed, more of the boy returned. His eyes, once completely black, now showed flickers of their original color. His voice, though still occasionally layered with others, carried more of his childlike innocence. "Today we face the final fragment," Father Riley announced as they gathered in the living room for the 40th ritual. The first word, Ed looked up from the ancient text he had been studying. The first fragment to exist, or the most powerful? "Both," Riley replied grimly. "The other 39 were created when this original entity was shattered. It is the core, the seed from which the others grew." Tommy sat quietly in the center of the ritual circle, watching them prepare with unnerving calm. Ellie sat nearby, her role in the proceedings carefully limited but essential. Over the past weeks, they had discovered she served as a kind of anchor for her brother, her presence helping to draw his true self back as the entities departed. "Something feels wrong," Lorraine said suddenly, looking round the room. "It has been too easy." "Easy," Martin balked. 3 people hospitalized, the house nearly destroyed, Tommy almost dying twice. "You call that easy?" "For entities this powerful," Lorraine clarified. "Yes. They have been allowing us to remove the fragments one by one." "Why?" Before anyone could answer, Tommy spoke, his voice entirely his own for the first time in weeks. "Because they wanted to be removed from me. They have somewhere else to go now." All eyes turned to the boy. "What do you mean, Tommy?" Rebecca asked, kneeling beside her son. Tommy pointed to the walls. "They are in the house now, all 39 of them. They were never really leaving, just moving, waiting for all of them to be together again before the last one joins them." Ed and Father Riley exchanged alarmed glances. "The house itself," Ed breathed. "Not just Tommy. The house was always the primary vessel." As if in response to this revelation, the entire structure began to vibrate. Pictures fell from walls. Furniture skidded across floors. The sensation was less like an earthquake and more like a massive creature awakening. "We need to begin now," Father Riley urged, opening his ritual book to the final exorcism rite, "before it is too late." They took their positions around Tommy. Father Riley began to recite the opening prayers, his voice gaining strength despite his exhaustion. Ed and Lorraine joined in, adding prayers from their tradition. The Chambers added their voices, the family bond creating a powerful current of love and protection around Tommy. The house shuddered violently. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Wood creaked and groaned. From somewhere deep within the walls came a sound like distant chanting in languages long dead to human ears. Tommy suddenly stiffened, his back arching unnaturally. His eyes rolled back to show only white. When he spoke, his voice contained only one other voice now, ancient and terrible in its power. "I am the first word," the entity announced. "The word that existed before creation. The word that will remain after all else ends." Father Riley pressed forward with the ritual, undeterred. In the name of all that is holy, I command you to depart from this child and return to your place of origin." The entity laughed, the sound making the windows rattle. "My place of origin, I have none. I have always existed, always will exist. Language is my domain. Reality is my creation." The house continued to transform around them. Walls rippled like liquid. Symbols appeared and disappeared across every surface. The floor beneath the ritual circle began to glow with an unearthly light. "The 39 have united within these walls," the entity continued. "They await only me, the first, to complete what was sundered centuries ago." "Why, Tommy?" Rebecca demanded, maternal fury overcoming her fear. "Why, my son?" "He can speak sounds no human tongue should form," the entity replied. "His mind can conceive of concepts that would shatter most human psyches. He is the perfect temporary vessel, but we no longer need him now." Tommy's body suddenly went limp. For a terrifying moment, Rebecca thought he had died. Then he gasped, his eyes flying. Open, normal and human, and filled with tears. "Mum," he whispered. As Rebecca embraced her son, the entity's voice now emanated from everywhere at once. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the very air itself. "The final unification has begun," it announced triumphantly. "For 40 days, you have unknowingly helped us reassemble. Each fragment you removed from the boy joined with the others in these walls, growing stronger through your own ritual energy." Father Riley looked stricken. "We have been manipulated. The exorcism was never meant to banish them. It was designed to strengthen them." The house began to transform more dramatically. Walls became transparent, revealing not studs and insulation, but vast, impossible spaces filled with shifting symbols and geometries that hurt the human eye to perceive. "What have we done?" Ed whispered. Lorraine suddenly straightened, a new determination in her eyes. "We have brought them all together in one place, exactly where we want them." The others looked at her in confusion as the house continued to warp around them. The ritual circle remained the only stable point in a reality that was quickly unraveling. "I have seen this moment," Lorraine continued, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Not as defeat, but as opportunity. They are strongest now, but also most vulnerable." From her pocket, Lorraine withdrew a small wooden box that no one had seen before. It bore the Vatican seal. "What Father Marin died protecting," she explained. "The true binding spell that Reverend Mills created. The one thing they truly fear." The small wooden box in Lorraine. Warren's hands seemed impossibly ordinary to contain their last hope against such ancient power. The Vatican seal on its lid glowed faintly in the unnatural light emanating from the transforming house around them. "How long have you had this?" Ed asked, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of creaking wood and shattering glass. "Father Maren sent it to me directly before he died," Lorraine replied. "Not to the Vatican, to me personally. He foresaw this moment." The house continued its horrifying metamorphosis. Walls rippled like cloth in wind. Floors buckled and reshaped themselves. The ceiling stretched upward into impossible darkness. Throughout it all, symbols flowed like living creatures across every surface. "What is happening?" Rebecca cried, clutching Tommy protectively. "The 40 fragments are reuniting," Father Riley explained, struggling to maintain his footing as the floor shifted beneath them. "Reality itself is being rewritten around us." The protective circle where they stood remained the only stable point in the chaos, a small island of order in a sea of cosmic madness. Outside the windows, the sky had turned an unnatural shade of red, though whether it was actually happening or merely how the entities wanted them to perceive it, none could say. The binding spell, Ed urged his wife. Whatever is in that box. Now is the time. Lorraine opened the box carefully. Inside lay a single piece of parchment, covered in symbols unlike any they had seen before, arranged in a precise geometric pattern. These are not containment symbols, Father Riley observed, leaning closer despite his exhaustion. This is something else entirely. Reverend Mills did not just contain the entities, Lorraine explained, carefully removing the parchment. He created a method to turn their nature against them. Language that unmakes language. The house seemed to sense the threat. The chaotic transformation paused momentarily. A sudden pressure filled the air, as though the atmosphere itself was listening. You cannot stop what has already begun, boomed a voice from everywhere at once. The united consciousness of the entities spoke with such power that blood began to trickle from their ears. The word will be spoken. What do we do? Martin asked, helping Ellie remain standing as the floor continued to warp around their protective circle. Lorraine studied the parchment intently. This is not a standard ritual. It requires the entities to be fully unified first. We must let them complete their joining. Are you insane? Father Riley objected. Once they fully unite, nothing will stop them. Trust her, Ed said firmly. Lorraine sees what we cannot. Around them, the transformation accelerated. The house was no longer recognizable as a human dwelling. The interior had become a vast, impossible space filled with shifting geometries and pulsing symbols. The walls breathed like living tissue. Reality thinned to the point where other dimensions became visible at the corners of their vision. In the center of it all, a shape began to form. Not human, not animal, but a living embodiment of symbols and concepts beyond human comprehension. The unified entity taking its true form. Now, Lorraine said, her voice oddly calm amid the chaos. Tommy, we need you. The boy looked up at her, fear evident in his eyes. Me, but they left me. Not completely, Lorraine explained gently. You can still speak their language. You are the only one who can pronounce these counter symbols correctly. She held the parchment where Tommy could see it. The boy studied the strange symbols, his expression shifting from fear to curiosity to recognition. I know these, he said, softly. They are like backwards versions of what was inside me. Exactly, Lorraine confirmed. Reverend Mills created them as opposites to the entity's language, antonyms to their power. The unified entity continued to coalesce in the center of the transformed space, growing more defined with each passing second. Its attention seemed focused on finishing its manifestation rather than the humans it presumed were no threat. Whatever we are doing, we must do it now, Father Riley urged, blood streaming from his nose as the pressure in the room intensified. Lorraine knelt beside Tommy, still within the protective circle. Read the symbols, Tommy. Speak them just as you sense. They should be pronounced. Tommy looked at the parchment again, then at the nearly formed entity hovering before them. Something passed between them, a moment of recognition. The entity suddenly seemed to realize the danger. No, it thundered, reaching toward them with appendages made of living symbols. The boy is mine. Now, Tommy, Ed urged. Read it now. Tommy began to speak, his voice changing as it had when possessed, but differently. Instead of being overwhelmed by other voices, his voice seemed to contain spaces between sounds. Impossible phonemes that human vocal cords should not produce, yet somehow did. As he spoke, the symbols on the parchment began to glow, then lift off the page, floating into the air before him. Each symbol he pronounced flew toward the entity like a weapon, embedding itself in the writhing mass of living language. The entity howled in agony, a sound that transcended normal hearing and vibrated through their bodies. Where the counter symbols struck, its form began to unravel, symbols cancelling each other out like matter meeting antimatter. "It is working," Father Riley breathed in astonishment. Tommy continued reading, his confidence growing with each symbol. The counteracting language flowed from him naturally now, as though he had always known how to speak it. The entity thrashed and fought, sending waves of force against them that strained their protective circle to its limits. "Keep going," Lorraine encouraged Tommy, even as she struggled to remain conscious under the psychic onslaught. The house itself began to fight back. Floorboards ripped themselves up, walls collapsed inward, the ceiling descended toward them. Only their small circle remained protected, and even that protection was failing. As Tommy pronounced the final symbols, the entity seemed to implode upon itself, collapsing inward like a dying star. A blinding light filled the room, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. A sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison reverberated through reality itself. Then, silence. When they dared to look again, the house had returned to normal. No shifting walls, no living symbols. Just an ordinary, somewhat damaged colonial home. In the center of the room where the entity had manifested, a small, dense black sphere hovered momentarily before dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. "What is that?" Martin asked, his voice. Horsed approached cautiously, drawing a crucifix from his pocket. The entities, all 40 fragments, bound together but neutralized. Like a black hole, Father Riley observed. Language collapsed in upon itself until it became matter. Lorraine knelt beside Tommy, who looked exhausted but entirely himself again. "You did it," she told him softly. "You spoke the counter-language perfectly. Is it over?" Rebecca asked, still clutching Ellie protectively. Ed carefully picked up the black sphere using a consecrated cloth. "Almost," he said. "We need to ensure this remains contained permanently. Somewhere even more secure than this house was meant to be." Outside, the unnatural red sky had cleared. Dawn was breaking over the neighborhood, golden light streaming through the windows. After 40 days of darkness, the light had returned. But as Lorraine helped Tommy to his feet, she noticed something troubling. For just a moment, symbols flickered. Beneath the skin of her own hand where it touched his, something had transferred between them. Something that might never truly be gone. 3 months after the battle at the Chambers house, life had settled into a fragile normalcy. The family had moved to a new home in a different state, leaving behind the colonial house that had nearly destroyed them. The property remained vacant, real estate agents struggling to explain the strange reluctance buyers felt upon viewing it. Ed and Lorraine Warren had returned to their own home, adding another case to their extensive files. The dense black sphere containing the neutralized entities now resided in their occult museum, secured within multiple layers of protection, visible to visitors only through thick glass with numerous religious symbols etched upon it. The Vatican had officially sealed all records of the case, though rumors persisted among certain circles within the church. Father Riley had been reassigned to a remote monastery in the Alps, his encounters with the entities having profoundly changed him. His assistant brothers remained under medical and spiritual care, slowly recovering from their traumatic experiences. On a warm autumn afternoon, the Warrens received unexpected visitors. Martin and Rebecca Chambers arrived with Tommy and Ellie, the family having traveled specifically to see them. "We wanted to thank you in person," Martin explained as they sat in the Warrens' living room, "for everything you did for our family." Tommy appeared remarkably recovered. The once pale, haunted boy now had healthy color in his cheeks. He played a handheld video game while the adults talked, occasionally, exchanging whispers with his sister. "How has Tommy been adjusting?" Lorraine asked, watching the children carefully. Rebecca smiled, though tension lingered around her eyes. "Better than expected. The nightmares have mostly stopped. His teachers say he is doing well, though he sometimes drifts off in language classes, almost like he finds them too simple." "And physically?" Ed inquired. "The doctors find nothing wrong with him," Martin replied. "All tests normal. No explanation for the marks that used to appear under his skin." Ed nodded, though he noticed how Lorraine unconsciously rubbed her own hands while looking at Tommy. Since the final confrontation, she had experienced occasional moments when symbols seemed to move beneath her skin, visible only to her. She had told no one, not even Ed, preferring to monitor the situation herself. "We brought something to show you," Rebecca said, opening her purse. She withdrew a small stack of papers. "Tommy has been drawing these. We thought you should see them." The drawings showed various scenes from everyday life, rendered with surprising skill for a child his age. But in each one, subtle patterns appeared in the background, in clouds, in the arrangement of trees, in the folds of clothing. Patterns that resembled the symbols they had confronted. "He says he just sees the world this way now," Rebecca explained. "That everything has a pattern underneath if you know how to look." Lorraine studied the drawings, a chill running through her. "Has he tried to write any of these symbols or speak them?" "No," Martin assured her. "We have been watching carefully, as you advised." While the adults talked, Tommy had wandered over to the display case containing the black sphere. He stood before it, head tilted slightly, as though listening to something inaudible to others. "Tommy," Ed called gently, "please do not touch the glass." The boy turned, his expression oddly serene. "They are not gone," he said simply. "Just sleeping." Rebecca quickly moved to her son, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Tommy, what do you mean by that?" "The words," Tommy replied, as though stating something obvious. "They cannot be destroyed, only transformed. That is what they wanted me to understand." The adults exchanged concerned glances. Ed approached, kneeling to the boy's level. "Tommy, do you still hear them? The entities from the house?" Tommy shook his head. "Not here. Sometimes I just know things I should not know. Like how language created everything. How the right words in the right order can change what is real." Lorraine felt the symbols beneath her own skin pulse slightly in response to his words. She had experienced similar insights since the confrontation, sudden flashes of linguistic knowledge that seemed to come from elsewhere. The 40 days were not just their preparation, Tommy continued, his voice taking on a quality beyond his years. They were mine too. I learned from them while they were inside me. Learned what? Ed asked carefully. Tommy smiled. How to speak without speaking. How to write without writing. He turned back to the sphere, placing his hand near the glass without touching it. For just a moment, the black surface within seemed to ripple in response to his proximity. Later, after the Chambers family had departed with promises to stay in touch, Ed found Lorraine in their study, looking through Father Merrin's notes. "You are concerned about the boy," Ed observed. Lorraine nodded slowly. "Not just Tommy, Ellie, too." and myself. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing her forearm. Watch. As Ed observed, faint symbols momentarily appeared beneath her skin, flowing like ink through water before fading. It happens when I think about certain concepts, she explained, when I reach for words that exist beyond our language. Could they still be active? Ed asked, glancing toward the museum where the sphere was housed. Could the binding be failing? I do not think it is failing, Lorraine said thoughtfully. I think this was always part of their plan. Not conquest, but transmission, seeding their knowledge into human vessels who would survive even if they were bound. What do we do, Lorraine? Closed Father Marin's file. We watch, we wait, we stay vigilant, and we pray that whatever knowledge they left behind in Tommy, in Ellie, in me, is not enough to ever speak the original word. That night, in 3 different locations, 3 different people had the same dream. Lorraine in her bed beside Ed, Tommy in his new home hundreds of miles away, Father Riley in his monastery cell high in the mountains. All 3 found themselves standing in an ancient library filled with books written in the symbols of the entities. And in the center, a pedestal holding a single page, the beginning of a sentence that once completed would remake all of reality. In the occult museum, unobserved by human eyes, the black sphere pulsed once with inner light, like a heart beating. In slow, patient time, on its surface, a single symbol appeared momentarily before fading back into the darkness. A symbol that, translated into human language, meant patience. Within the secure Vatican archives, a new box took its place on a shelf of dangerous knowledge. Its label read, simply, Sei, Isei, 591 bytes. The Warren Exorcism, sealed by PayPal order, and inside a warning for future generations. Some words, once spoken, can never truly be unheard.